Howdy, folks. Thanks for checking into Mr. Ulrich's Land of Biology. I, of course, am Mr. Ulrich. If your parents are anything like me, they were raised watching quite a bit of Sesame Street, and maybe you watched quite a bit of Sesame Street yourself. Sesame Street, of course, about a neighborhood where there are people and puppets, but they all have different roles: the shopkeeper and the baker and the policeman and the mailman and all kinds of stuff. And like I said, some of them are people, some of them are puppets. The people have changed over the years. I grew up watching Bob McGrath sing about who are the people in your neighborhood. But the puppets have largely stayed the same, and there's always a mailman, there's always a shopkeeper, there's always Oscar the Grouch, right? And they all have their different roles that they carry out. The show itself is really about the interactions between the different characters on the show and the roles that they play. So when we think about ecology, especially when we start thinking about community ecology, we can think about an ecological community like a neighborhood with lots of different roles. And we'll go back to this idea, this model, this representation over and over again. Here's a portion of a neighborhood that we know. This is downtown New Paltz, just going down Main Street there. And when we look, you can see, and you can go down Main Street in your mind, really. You can think of all the different businesses, and each one of those businesses has a different kind of role that it fills in the community. We have banks, and there's jewelers, and there's bistros, and there's places to get burritos, and there's other places to get to burritos, and then we have other places to get burritos, and there's 3 or 4 different places where you can get pizza. But even when we think about all the different places to get burritos or pizza, each one of those places is a little bit different from the other one, right? If you want to get a quick burrito, you used to be able to go to Taco Shack, right? And just grab a not great burrito. And then if you really wanted to get a burrito that people put a whole bunch of time into, you could go down to Mexicali Blue. No, I'm not getting any money from Mexicali Blue for saying this, but they make a really good burrito and they spend a bunch of time into it. So you're going to spend quite a bit more money at Mexicali Blue than you would have at Taco Shack. So even though we have the same businesses, they kind of differentiate a little bit. They serve a little slightly different part of the clientele. This means that just like we can describe the role that a business plays within a community, we can describe the role that a population or type of organism plays within an ecological community or an ecosystem. We're describing what that business or what that population does. We're describing its niche. Now, when people ask me, when they meet me for the first time, Mr. Ulrich, what is it that you do? They're asking me, how do I go about getting the resources that I need, primarily money. They're asking me about my job. What am I employed with? And I tell them I'm a teacher. And then invariably, one of the next questions is going to be, where? Where do I teach? And so I tell them at New Paltz High School. And when we're describing a ecological niche, those same 2 factors need to be involved, right? We need to describe where the organism is carrying out its job, so something that describes its habitat or biome, and we can get really, really specific here, not just underwater or on land, right? What type of water? Freshwater or marine? Are we talking about underwater? Are we talking about floating on top of the water? Are we talking about floating right underneath the surface of the water? Because all of those are different places where an organism can carry out its job. And now we're also talking about how it gets its fuel, right? How does it get what it needs in order to run its metabolism and gain material for assimilation? So this is where we start getting into producer, consumer, autotroph, heterotroph, some of these terms that you may have heard before. For example, here's the good old water strider, an organism that many of you have seen before. I hope so. They're pretty common around here. You see them sketching around. They float around on the surface of the water. They like calmer parts of streams, and you'll find them in ponds and sometimes in lakes as well. They are very effective predators. They hang out on the top of the water, so they use the surface tension, and they wait for stupid small animals to come to the surface of the water where they grab them with their modified forelegs and jam them onto their piercing, sucking mouth parts and slurp out the insides. So a top water predator of small animals. The concept of niche then becomes critical to describing competition from an ecological standpoint. Now, I know you've heard of competition, but when students then come to me and we start talking about competition in ecology, they immediately think about two organisms going toe to toe, right, and actively, directly competing for things, and that's not always the case. In ecology, competition comes from niche overlap. Now we can, again, go back to our business model. We've already kind of hinted at this when we talked about all the different places to get burritos in New Paltz, right? There's some niche overlap there because they're all in the same area, right? So they got the geographic part covered, and they're all trying to sell food to college students or other people who are living in the area or visiting. And they do it slightly different ways, right? Remember, Mexicali Blue spends a lot of time, but you get a good burrito, you're going to pay more, where Taco Shack, mediocre burrito for a lot less. And clearly there weren't enough customers to go around, and Mexicali Blue and the other burrito places did a better job than Taco Shack did, because now Taco Shack is closed. They lost the competition. They didn't get enough resources and dropped out. Now, this brings up this idea of how many burrito places can the village of New Paltz support, right? What is the carrying capacity of burrito shops in New Paltz? And we can think of this ecologically as well, right? What is the size of a population or the number of organisms that we can have before we start getting into competition and populations start dying back? And when we start thinking about resources, we're thinking about space, right? Home space, nesting space, stuff like this. We're thinking about, of course, access to food and nutrients. We got to remember plants too, right? Access to sun and root space. The nutrients have to be there. And don't kid yourself, you are actively involved in competition for mates as sexually reproducing organisms. So when we look at an ecosystem like the desert, we typically don't think of it as having a whole lot of organisms. And compared to a tropical rainforest, they don't. And why not? Why are there so few organisms there? Right? There's plenty of sunlight. How do we get from a desert that looks like this to a desert that looks like this? Right? What's missing? What do we add in order to get those roundies of green? Well, in the middle of each one of these circular pads here is a wellhead or a pipe of some sort or other, and they, of course, are supplying water, because what's keeping the desert from turning into a tropical paradise, of course, is access to water. In the desert, water is the resource that is in shortest supply and is really what's keeping populations down. And so water then becomes the limiting factor within that population. This means that when populations rise to that carrying capacity for that limiting factor, or start to get closer to it, they start to compete more, and you start to get more losers, and you have more individuals who are dying off, and the population starts to go down. So I can increase competition in two ways. I can either decrease the amount of resources, or I can increase the population. Now, we have a couple different varieties of sports here, sports competitions at New Paltz. Here's some students playing pickleball. This is what we would call an intramural sport, played within the walls, because this is New Paltz students playing against New Paltz students. We can compare this with stuff like lacrosse, where we have New Paltz students playing against other schools. So that is an intramural sport. And we have two different types of competition ecologically as well. We have interspecific, which is between two different species, and intraspecific, between the same species. So intramural is like intraspecific, right? Same school. Intermural sports and interspecific competition between two different species, two different schools. Let's take a quick peek at some birds. And are they competing for food? Of course not. Why not? Because food is not a limiting factor yet. Give it time, and these birds will eat all of the food, and if we don't feed them some more, they will be in competition. How about these birds here? Are they competing for food? Yeah, probably. They're trying to find insects which are pretty limited. And so some of those chickens are going to be better at getting, finding, and catching the bugs and grain seeds than the other ones are going to be. We should take some time to describe a few of the different categories of the different types of interactions so that you have the terms that you need when you are tasked with describing an interaction. Take a look at the picture here. See how many different interactions you can describe. Hit pause and take a look, write a few down. How many of them involved people? Did all of them involve people? Are there different types of plants that are interacting with each other there? Because I can see quite a bit of crowding going on, and I bet the taller plants are competing for light and out-competing the shorter plants. Maybe the shorter plants have other adaptations that allow them to survive. Maybe they have a different way of getting their light resource that allows them to kind of not have an overlapping niche. One of the big classes or groups of interactions are when one organism eats another organism or eats from another organism. We call these trophic relationships because you are passing energy from one trophic level to the next trophic level, and like in the energy pyramid. When you think of a trophy, you probably might think of something like the Stanley Cup from hockey. This goes back to ancient Greece. One of the prizes for winning the Olympics was you got free wine. And you got a big special cup for all your free wine. So here's a predator. So predation is one type of trophic relationship. There is also herbivory and detritivory. Most of my students have heard of herbivory before. This is consuming plants. You can almost think of it, though, as organisms preying upon plants. It's just the plants don't run away, so they don't have to hunt. Detritivory is one that some of my students don't know so much about. Detritus is dead stuff. Right, so detritivores are things that are not just decomposers, but also scavengers. I do like to point out that since most of us do not go out and hunt our food, we wait for something else to kill the food, and then we go to the grocery store and pick it up. So really, we're just going to this place where there's a whole bunch of dead stuff. So we are scavengers. No discussion of ecological interactions is complete without bringing in symbiotic relationships. Bios for living and sim for together, like lichens and ticks and remora on sharks and tapeworms living in your intestines. All symbiotic relationships involve two different species living in a close, interdependent relationship. And if the word close sounds a little subjective, it is. I'm not really sure how close is close enough. Who knows? But if you notice, not all of these are like everybody's happy. The relationship has to work out for at least somebody. Even mosquitoes is a symbiotic relationship. The mosquito makes out. The bitee does not so much. There are three main types or classes of symbiotic relationships that you should be able to describe. One is when both parties, both of the species, are benefited from the relationship, so it's mutually beneficial. We call this mutualism. It's what most people think of when they start thinking about symbiotic relationships. Lichen and coral, right? The lichen is a fungus that has a algae living inside of it. So the algae can go through photosynthesis, and the fungus gives the algae a place to live. Coral is an animal that has a photosynthetic bacteria that lives inside of it. Here, of course, is Nemo, a clownfish living within an anemone. Getting some protection, both of them kind of mutually protecting each other. But there are cases where one benefits and the other really is not adversely affected, is not benefited, but isn't hurt. Right, we carry around a whole host of bacteria. Now, some of them are mutualistic. Some of them are giving us stuff that we need. Some of them are just there. They're not really doing much other than taking up space. The shark is not benefited from having the remora swim along next to it and eat up all the little bits. Cleaner wrasses are different. If you're thinking about the sharks that have they pull into a spot and all the little fish, the wrasses come out and eat the parasites off of them. That's mutualism. But the remora, the little fish that have the suction cup on their heads, they're just hanging out next to the shark, waiting for the messy shark to eat some food, and then they eat the little bits. Commensal means at the same table, so one is eating the scraps of the other one. My favorite group of symbiotic relationships are parasites. This is where one is benefited and the other is actually harmed. We typically don't get killed by our parasites. That would be silly, right? And then the parasite doesn't have a place to live. Another type of symbiotic relationship that you don't have to know about for a Regis exam, but are pretty cool and are ecologically important around here, are parasitoids. Parasitoids are like parasites, except they do end up killing their host. Around here we have what are called tachinid flies. We call these friendly flies. If you ever had they look just like regular house flies, but they're huge. They land on you and just like, they're slow and stupid. They don't bite. What they do is they lay their eggs inside of tent caterpillars, gypsy moth caterpillars. And as the egg hatches, the larvae actually kills the caterpillar itself, and then the larvae pupate and fly away as another fly. The last type of interaction we'll talk about is altruism. Altruism is when one organism helps out another organism and doesn't get any benefit from it. In fact, it might get harmed. It risks harm. It's when one organism is nice to another organism. It can be interspecific or intraspecific, which is why it's not symbiotic. Classic examples here, meerkats. That's a sentry meerkat that's watching out for danger while the rest of the meerkats are head down foraging. Of course, who's going to get picked off? The sentry meerkat, so it's putting itself at risk. And the fairy wrens in the picture up above there are notorious for helping raise the young of other fairy wrens that aren't their mate. And we got to be careful when it comes to altruism. We have a tendency to anthropomorphize. That means put human-like characteristics and reasoning behind non-human behaviors. There's always an angle here when it comes to being nice. They're not just being nice for the sake of being nice. The meerkat's actually related to all of those other meerkats that it's watching. So it's helping out, but really what it's doing is it's ensuring that its genes survive into the next generation. And the fairy wrens, the reason why they help out one fairy wren is there's an expectation that that fairy wren will turn around and help it out when it needs help rearing its young. And if it doesn't, then they don't help each other. They kind of develop this buddy system. But it certainly is interesting to think about and look out for. That's enough. I'll stop there. Thanks again for checking into Mr. Ulrich's Land of Biology. If you have any questions, please put them in Google Classroom if that's where you're getting this, or down in the comment section of YouTube, or even just send me an email. Other than that, I miss y'all, and I can't wait until we can actually have regular school or something approaching regular school, and I can actually talk to my peoples. I miss y'all. Hope y'all staying safe and healthy and washing your hands, and I will see you soon.